Chantal Mauduit was standing on the peak of K2, the killer mountain, unable to see anything. She'd been blinded by the insane levels of UV radiation and now stood no chance of descending from 8,600 meters by herself. There was no one around to help. Panicked, Chantal hid inside a snow cave and was slowly dying. Would anyone come to find her? Would anyone put their own life on the line to save the Black Widow of mountaineering? This is the story of a notorious French female mountaineer, Chantal Mauduit, who kept walking a razor's edge. So, viewer discretion is advised. This could have been the beginning of a Hollywood biopic movie. 5-year-old Chantal's parents moved from Paris closer to the Alps, and the girl developed an interest in the mountains. At 15, she got into climbing, quickly earned a mountain guide certification, and conquered France's most challenging routes. At 22, Chantal came third in an ice climbing competition, beating Europe's best mountaineers, all of them men. After this, she was accepted into France's Federation of Mountaineering and Climbing, and the name of Chantal Mauduit started gaining recognition in the community. However, the community members couldn't imagine what was lurking behind the girl's sweet smile. When Chantal scaled Huascarán, the highest peak of the northern Andes, at almost 6,800 meters, she made her way back down on a paraglider. One of the other mountaineers was so impressed by her that he immediately invited Chantal to participate in his expedition to Mount Everest. At 27, she decided to conquer the world's highest mountain. Although she failed, Chantal agreed that going forward, she'd only climb 8,000ers. She possessed the necessary skills and training and was incredibly good at acclimating to the high altitudes with all their trials. There was something else, however, her beauty. Chantal was attractive, outgoing, fun, and approachable, and undoubtedly, sexy. Back then, mountaineering was still a predominantly male-dominated field, so the good-looking French lady enjoyed a lot of attention at climbing camps. And rest assured, Chantal used this power actively. She liked driving the men around her crazy and even provoking them. During Chantal's second attempt at conquering Everest, 2 mountaineers were so desperate to get her attention that they challenged each other to a fight and started throwing rocks at each other. However, Chantal gave men attention when it benefited her. She never carried anything heavy in her backpack, taking a toy duck instead. All of the necessities were carried for her by men. Now, let's do some math. Mountaineering gear alone can weigh as much as 10 to 15 kilograms. And if we add clothes and food into the mix, that weight increases. In addition, since we're talking about climbing 8,000ers, climbers also need to carry oxygen tanks. The higher you go, the lower the air pressure and the less oxygen your body can extract from it. And after crossing the 8,000 meters mark, there's so little of it that your body can no longer function properly. It literally starts dying cell by cell. This threshold is called the death zone. After crossing it, you cannot rest no matter how long you stay in one place. There, people lose their minds to hypoxia, cold temperatures, and desperation. Now, imagine you're a climber who's been scaling an 8,000er for days, if not weeks. It's cold, there's snow, you're suffering from constant discomfort and tiredness, and someone's loading you up with extra kilos because they don't want to carry their own gear. But despite this behavior on the part of Chantal, the men adored her. And a U.S. mountaineer, Thor Kieser, fell head over heels for her. Surprisingly, Chantal reciprocated his feelings. If only Thor knew the steep price he would pay for this fling. But for the time being, the two were dating and planning a shared ascent to a 3,000er, a peak named Fitz Roy, located in Argentina. It was an expensive trip, so Chantal even had to lead some mountain tours to make some money. However, right before departure, she unexpectedly claimed she lacked the funds for the air ticket. Thor, being madly in love, got another job as a pizza courier and made enough to cover his lover's travel expenses. But the moment the couple set out on their journey, Chantal's attitude to Thor drastically changed. She paid him virtually no heed. The man couldn't understand what was happening and kept trying to win his beloved woman's heart over. However, with every new failed attempt at conquering the peak, things kept deteriorating. It was the 18th hour of yet another attempt. That whole time, Thor had been single-handedly plotting the route and carrying all the gear. His muscles felt as if they were made out of lead, and all of his clothes were completely soaked in the rain. At about 11 p.m., Thor made it to a challenging area not far from the summit. He held on to a rock and was already transferring his weight onto it when suddenly he felt it move. The next moment, the boulder got dislodged and hurtled down toward Chantal. Keezer only had enough time to scream that she'd be careful when suddenly a rock fragment cut through his rope, and the man plummeted from the ledge. He hit the rocks several times before being lucky enough to land 20 meters below. Thor was alive, but his face was badly injured, and his right hand had multiple fractures. Luckily, the other mountaineers quickly came to the rescue and transported him to the base camp. What Thor found out there dealt him an additional emotional blow. Chantal said she no longer loved him and would depart for the summit in the morning with another team. Broken in every way, the man returned home and started his rehabilitation, but didn't stop thinking about Chantal. When she planned an ascent to the Killer Mountain, Thor immediately started looking for a place in her team. The peak the French climber set her sights on was one of the deadliest and most technically challenging summits in the world, K2. It's the world's second highest mountain, standing at 8,611 meters tall. There are several routes to its peak, but they all look like almost vertical walls of rock and ice. At the time, only 3 women had managed to conquer it. Of course, Chantal wanted to become the 4th. So she joined a Swiss team that had received a summiting permit. However, almost from the very start, the woman put her participation in the expedition at risk. The team's route started in Pakistan, a Muslim country with its own strict rules and regulations. There, women are prohibited from being in the street without a male chaperone or wearing revealing clothes. However, Chantal completely disregarded the rules by walking alone while wearing shorts. Apart from this, being disrespectful to the local customs. This could also pose a deadly threat to her as a foreigner. But, just like before, the woman got away with it and successfully made it to the K2 base camp. There, she was welcomed by Thor. He joined a US-Soviet expedition, being on the same team as the best mountaineers of that time, including Ed Viesturs, Scott Fisher, and Vladimir Beliberdy. However, Chantal didn't even look at Thor. Instead, she was having fun with other men at the camp. After acclimatization, both teams got started on their parallel routes to the top. At the same time, the Swiss and Chantal were planning to climb in the woman's usual alpine style. This means they didn't waste time and energy on carrying and installing ropes. The US team was the one to do that, and they noticed that the Swiss were insolent enough to use the safety lines the Americans had installed. However, when the Swiss team went for their first summit attempt, they were stopped by a storm. Chantal, on the other hand, didn't want to go back down, but according to the laws of Pakistan, which had issued the climbers a climbing permit for this peak, switching teams in the middle of an ascent was prohibited. So Chantal had to descend with the Swiss. However, that's when Thor came in with a desperate measure. He offered her to join their team. Of course, she said yes. The man was convinced he'd have a chance to get his lover back, but Chantal started an affair with Ed Viesturs instead. And rumor has it, not only with him. However, on July 28th, the mountaineers gathered and trudged toward the summit in small groups. Thor, Ed, and Chantal reached Camp 3 in 2 days, but the weather on the mountain wasn't too welcoming, so Ed decided to join the other mountaineers on the slope that day and go back down. As for Chantal and Thor, they were now alone, and although she continued ignoring him, she still made him carry all her gear. However, it was physically impossible to carry all of it, so very soon Thor had to abandon almost all of their things, including both of their sleeping bags, ropes, and most of the food. Only then did he manage to keep moving. This didn't matter at all though, because they were still very far from the top, and it was almost nightfall. They had to sleep in the snow, and come morning, Thor had frostbite on his legs. Barely able to move, he decided to go back down to fetch his sleeping bag. The only thing he heard from Chantal was a demand to grab her bag as well. Keezer, still in love, followed the order. On his way back, he bumped into Alexei Nikiforov, who joined them on the way up. After another night under the stars, the 3 of them reached Camp 4. From there, the exhausted Thor started laying a path to the summit through a 50-centimeter layer of snow at dawn. Alexei was walking below him with Chantal. Each step at such an altitude was literally sucking the energy out of a person. Just 200 meters from the top, Thor realized he'd completely run out, and his only chance of survival was to immediately descend. Chantal tried to talk him out of it, but luckily, he didn't change his decision. This sealed the fates of all 3 mountaineers. Meanwhile, Chantal and Alexei continued their ascent, and at 5 p.m. on August 3rd, Chantal conquered K2. She was standing on the summit, dizzy with success and blind. During the ascent, she'd lost her sunglasses, and the sun rays reflecting off the snow caused a cornea burn, almost completely impairing her vision. She stood no chance of going back down by herself and didn't have a partner or even a satellite phone to call for help. Terrified and disoriented, Chantal, by some miracle, found a snow burrow dug by another mountaineer and just hid inside it. But it wasn't deliverance. It was more likely her future grave. Without a sleeping bag, Chantal started freezing fast, and the death zone was constantly sucking the remaining energy out of her. It looked like the end. However, Chantal was somehow miraculously found by Nikiforov, who was descending from the top. He couldn't leave her to die, but she'd already gotten frostbite on her limbs and was in a half-conscious state, constantly falling asleep while walking. Assisting the descent of someone in that state from the top of K2 is a gargantuan task that could turn into suicide at any moment, especially when Chantal and Alexei reached the bottleneck. It's a narrow couloir overhung by giant ice blocks called seracs. Any moment, one of them might fall onto the Mountaineers. But this wasn't even Alexei's most serious problem. The bottleneck's slope has a 60-degree angle. There was no chance he could descend without ropes, let alone literally carrying down the unconscious Chantal. And Nikiforov had ditched his own rope on his way to the top. But as it turned out, the rope had been found by Thor, who'd already passed this area and installed it on the bottleneck to make the descent easier for Chantal. So Alexei grabbed onto it, but the moment he started moving, a crampon got detached from his boot. He lost his balance, fell, and started sliding down the steep slope toward the abyss. But the rope installed by Thor caught him right on time. When Alexei reached Camp 4, he was close to dying of mountain sickness, physical exhaustion, and the cold. He literally collapsed into the tent put up by Thor, who was barely alive himself due to having spent a long time in the death zone. But Nikiforov was alone. As it turned out, at some point, he left Chantal to descend by herself. Kieser was beside himself with worry, but realized that if he were to go searching for the woman, he would surely die. In 45 minutes, Chantal appeared on the slope, her arms outstretched like a sleepwalker. Thor dragged her into the tent and started warming her feet and feeding her hot soup. But none of these things brought comfort since the Mountaineers were still in the death zone, where the body is incapable of recovering. 3 days passed, and Thor realized that time was running out for all three of them. They would either descend or inevitably die. So the trio got on their way. However, in 3 hours, they only managed to cover 60 meters. Upset, Thor started setting up a tent, and Alexei continued his descent alone, leaving the shelter given to him by Chantal and Kieser, although this was physically beyond his capacity. So the next morning, he radioed Ed Viesters and Scott Fisher, asking for help. They said they were on their way, and Thor was able to let off a sigh of relief. But he didn't know what happened the moment the two climbers left their camp. They tied themselves into a rope team and started their ascent. Suddenly, Ed felt the hairs on his body stand on end, feeling the imminent danger of death. He started digging himself into the snow, surprising his rope partner. In just a second, Scott also realized what was happening. But it was too late. A wall of snow was moving toward them. Ed managed to hide in a small cave he dug, and Scott was hit by the avalanche and got carried downward. The rope between them got strung, and Ed got yanked out of his hideaway and tugged along the slope in the same direction. He grabbed his pickaxe and drove it as deep as it went, hoping to stop the sliding, and he succeeded. Now, the two mountaineers supposed to save others were hanging a few meters from the abyss. It was a moment of pure horror, and no one thought that Ed and Scott would be okay. They got up, dusted themselves off, and resumed their ascent. But when they met Thor and Chantal, the two seemed to be about to die. It took 2 long and challenging days to transport them to Camp 1. Surprisingly, by the end of the descent, Chantal's condition improved so much that she could walk by herself. She was welcomed like a heroine and basked in male attention, telling everyone about conquering the peak and how much her eyes hurt. And that was it. Thor was shocked and, obviously, had an entirely different opinion on what had happened on the slope.
Chantal wouldn't have got down without me, for sure. I don't believe she would have made it.
Alexei also added a bit of criticism to this story. He claimed that Chantal hadn't actually reached the peak. However, she was still credited with that ascent. After this situation, the French lady was given the nickname Black Widow in the mountaineering community, as it became clear that she didn't care one bit about the deadly danger in which she put the men she manipulated. It also seemed like she couldn't care less about all of the rules because after being given a fine for illegally switching her team, she tore the document to pieces and threw them in the official's face. Despite all this, Chantal continued enjoying colossal success and found the investment to fund all her subsequent climbs. She had a few unsuccessful attempts at conquering Mount Everest, and in 1995, she tried again as a part of a group organized by a mountaineering legend, Rob Hall. He was a member of the Order of the British Empire for his rock climbing achievements and had summited Everest 5 times, which was a record at the time. However, Chantal's expedition with him turned into another scandal. She ended up being the slowest member of the group and held up others. When they reached an altitude of 8,750 meters, her lips went blue and her eyes started unfocusing. Rob said she had to return to the camp. Having no energy to answer, she nodded, turned around, and fell unconscious after walking several meters. And again, an entire group of mountaineers had to risk their own lives to get Chantal down. Among them were the expedition's leader, Rob, and Ed Viesters, who was saving the woman's life for the second time. And just like before, she came round very quickly and, on the very next day, was already having fun at the camp as if nothing had happened. Furious with such irresponsibility and ungratefulness, Hall said that from that moment, Chantal would be banned from joining his expeditions. He never found out that, in this way, he'd saved her life again. The following year, he led another group to Mount Everest, and at the very same time, Chantal was trying to conquer a neighboring peak named Lhotse, which had never been summited by a woman at the time. However, a horrific storm hit the Himalayas. Most mountaineers stopped their ascent and managed to hide from the brutal force of nature, but Rob Hall and Scott Fisher weren't saved. They lost their lives on Mount Everest that day. Unaware of this, Chantal descended to the camp and claimed she'd conquered Lhotse. But because she was alone, had no proof, and enjoyed a bad reputation, a lot of mountaineers didn't believe her words. And even with everything we know about Chantal Mauduit, the ending of her story is still too unexpected. In 1998, Chantal and her Sherpa friend named Ung Shring were staying at Camp 2 on a mountain called Dao Laghiri. An Italian climbing team warned her about a dangerous crevice higher on the route and left. Chantal thanked them and zipped her tent closed. 5 days later, when the Italians returned, they saw Chantal and Ung Shring's tent in the same spot, half buried in the snow. When they dug the tent out, both mountaineers inside it turned out to be dead. Chantal had a broken neck, and the Sherpa had suffocated. They were thought to have been crushed by an ice rock, but no one has seen it and can attest to that. It's unknown what actually happened to Chantal. However, most climbers that had known her weren't shocked at all.
Do you expect me to say, you want me to tell you in front of the camera I was expecting her to die? Yes.
She disregarded her own safety and the lives of those around her. She behaved as though the rules didn't apply to her, and mountains don't forgive those who underestimate them. So, who was Chantal Mauduit really? A Black Widow? Or a talented mountaineer yearning for absolute freedom?